The next optimization we'll work on is outputting multiple errors. So far, we've been outputting a single error rather than all of them. This is so that we don't overwhelm the user with errors. It would clutter the form visually. However, in some cases you may want to output multiple errors for a specific input. An example of this would be the password field. I'm sure you've encountered a fair number of password fields. They vary with their own rules. Some examples would be requiring a minimum character length, using various characters, or using numbers. This is so that the user has a strong password. It would be annoying to type out a password only to learn that it's missing something. It would be preferential to render every error. This will allow the user to adjust their password based on our rules. Keep in mind that this is just my opinion. There are different ways to tackle user experience. It depends on the app you're building. Regardless, I think this would be a good example of how to output multiple errors at once. Search for the password field if you haven't already. We're going to focus on the first field because the second field will match the first one. It's not required to repeat the rules. If the first input isn't valid, then neither is the second one. vValidate implements a fast exit strategy. It's a strategy that'll end the validation process if a single rule is broken. If there are additional rules, they won't be checked. This results in fewer resources and faster feedback. This is why you'll only see one error at a time for an input. We'll want to override this strategy if we want to output multiple errors. On the field component, we're going to bind a property called Bales. We'll set it to false. The Bales property will tell the field component not to use the fast exit strategy. This means every rule will be checked even if a previous rule was broken. It's important to bind the Bales property because we want the component to interpret the value as a false Boolean value. The next step is to loop through the errors. Here's where a new problem arises. Currently, we're using the error message component to output the errors. However, it'll only output one error at a time even if the Bales property is added to the component. We're going to need to customize the behavior of the field component if we want to output multiple errors. The field component has a slot we can take advantage of. It's the only way we'll be able to output multiple error messages. We're going to create an opening and closing field tag. Since we're going to add some content, we need to output the input tag. vValidate will not do it for us. Inside, we'll pass in an input tag. We'll cut and paste the placeholder, class, and type attributes from the field component to the input tag. Next, we need to tell vValidate which input should be validated inside the slot content. We're going to add the vSlot directive to destructure the field property. The field property is an object with the features for adding validation to an input. We must add this property if we want to validate the input. Otherwise, vValidate will not be able to perform validation on the password field. We can bind the property by adding the vBind directive to the input element. We'll set it to field. Next, we'll work on the error. Below the input, we're going to add a div tag with the class text red 600. We're using a div tag because we'll be outputting multiple errors. Each error should be placed on a separate line. The div tag will assure us of that. From the vSlot directive, we're going to destructure an array called errors. The errors array will contain a list of errors triggered by the input. It's important to understand that the array will only be available if we set the Bales property to false. Otherwise, we'll always get one error. We can loop through this array to output the errors. On the div tag, we'll add the v_for directive. The expression will be the following: error in errors. Inside the tags, we'll output the error with an expression. One last thing, we'll need to add a key. We'll bind the key attribute to the error alias in the loop. This attribute isn't necessary, but Vue recommends we set it anyway. We're almost finished. The last step is to update the rules for the password. At the moment, we don't have a pair of rules that will appear along each other. Scroll to the schema. In the password field, set the minimum rule to 9. Next, set the excluded rule to password. Allowing users to set their password to password is not considered to be a safe practice. We should prevent users from using specific passwords during registration. We're finished. Save your changes and refresh the page. I'm going to type password into the password field. This input will cause the minimum and excluded rules to break. The messages are the same because vValidate uses the same message for every rule. As long as you see multiple error messages, then you're good to go. We'll continue optimizing the form in the next lecture.